Hello everyone, today's topic is looking at the similarities and the differences between Obsessive-Compulsive Personality Disorder, or OCPD, and Narcissistic Personality Disorder, NPD. Now these can sometimes seem similar due to many overlapping behaviours such as being overly controlling, being overly critical, and having high, sometimes unrealistic standards. In both cases, they might micromanage others or maybe just take over tasks completely. In both cases, they could leave their partners and others feeling unheard, invalidated, and judged harshly, and this often leads to conflict. But among other things, OCPD's preoccupation to duty, procedure, and extremely high standards can be mistaken for NPD's self-aggrandizing, arrogance, and their sense of entitlement, but the core motivations differ significantly. And also, just to clarify, although they can be comorbid, Obsessive-Compulsive Personality Disorder differs from Obsessive-Compulsive Disorder in the sense that there are personality traits like rigidity in thinking and their approaches to things, but there's not necessarily intrusive thoughts or compulsions. So to begin with, OCPD is part of the Cluster C group of personality disorders, and this is characterized by fearful or anxious behaviors. And with OCPD, we commonly see a drive for perfectionism, a preoccupation with details, order, procedures, but it's often at the cost of real productivity and real connection with others. Whereas narcissistic personality is part of the Cluster B group of personality disorders, and these are characterized by dramatic, emotional, or erratic behaviors. With NPD, we see an inflated sense of self-importance and superiority. There's a constant need for attention, admiration, and validation. But there is also being highly competitive and being low in agreeableness. With both, though, we often see rigid, high standards and perfectionism. So in both cases, there might be criticism of others for not reaching their standards, and this can cause tension and strain in relationships, both personal and professional. But with OCPD, the criticism is usually driven by an internal need for things to be done a certain way. There's a need for order and perfection. With narcissism, however, they can also demand high standards and perfection, but this tends to come from a belief that they're special and entitled to only the best. Another difference with the criticism is that people with OCPD tend to hold themselves to the same if not higher standards that they demand from others, and they can be highly critical of themselves. Whereas narcissistic people, they believe themselves to be superior and they often have double standards, so their standards only apply to others, not themselves. That being said, narcissistic people can be critical of themselves. However, it's usually because someone might not be seeing how great they are, and that criticism typically gets projected outwards onto others. Secondly, in both cases we see a difficulty with accepting criticism, and both can react badly to poor feedback. In both cases, they can become defensive and try to justify their actions. Someone with OCPD, criticism, that might threaten their need for structure and order, and they can react defensively just to try to protect that need. For instance, they might claim that their way is the most appropriate way, the most ethical way, maybe the most logical way. With narcissism, however, criticism can feel like an attack on their false and fragile sense of self, and they can react with anger or dismissal to try to protect their image and try to retain some sense of superiority. Next, there's being highly judgmental of others. They can be highly judgmental of other people's efforts or their choices, because it's either their way or the wrong way. Now with OCPD, this is often based on rigid moral codes or maybe practical standards, because they believe their way is correct. For example, they might even lecture someone about doing something properly, or maybe just properly from their perspective. But they might genuinely think that they're helping, even though they're making someone else feel inferior. But narcissistic people, they tend to see other people as inferior anyway, and in many cases, they want them to feel inferior as well, because they only get to feel superior by making others feel inferior. So they tend to judge others, they tend to belittle them just to reinforce their sense of superiority. So if a narcissistic person were to lecture someone, it might only be just to elevate themselves to feed their own ego. Moving on to number 4, with both OCPD and NPD there is a need for control, and in both cases they can dominate decision making, even dismiss other people's input. They might even micromanage other people's tasks. With OCPD, the need for control tends to be rooted in anxiety around imperfection or chaos, whereas with narcissism, it's just about power, dominance, or maybe trying to seek admiration. Number 5, there can be a strong focus on achievement. With OCPD, there is a lot of prioritizing of tasks and efficiency, but this is often more about procedure and productivity and is often at the expense of emotional connection. But the productivity can actually be compromised due to their need to do things in a certain way and to a certain standard, and their constant interfering might actually be more of a hindrance. With NPD, the focus on achievements is really just to gain admiration and to bolster their sense of superiority, and in many cases they will blame others for their own failings, but they will take credit for other people's ideas and productivity. In both cases, though, they are neglecting other people's emotions or even their needs, just to focus on their own goals. Moving on to number 6, and that's how they respond to failure. With OCPD, failure can cause great anxiety and shame, and they tend to blame themselves. But failure can also prompt them to redouble their efforts, even though the project is not that big a deal or maybe it's just a lost cause. With NPD, though, again we see shame, because failure threatens their ego and quite often they react by blame shifting, denial, or claims that they were cheated or sabotaged somehow. Sometimes they might even go into a rage. Number 7 is empathy. People with OCPD may lack emotional attunement due to their focus on tasks and procedures, but they're not necessarily intentionally cruel. They might care about others, but that care tends to manifest in practical ways. With NPD, there is a lack of empathy and they're often self-centered, self-focused, and they prioritize their own wants and their own needs above others. So if a partner is upset, someone with OCPD may offer practical or logical solutions to fix the problem, but they're often missing the emotional needs. Whereas someone with NPD, well, they might just be dismissive, claim the partner is being overly dramatic, or in some cases, they might even exploit the pain for their own gratification. Lastly, in their personal relationships, a partner with OCPD may create tension by enforcing rigid rules, criticizing imperfections, or prioritizing tasks over emotional connection and intimacy, so the partner might feel controlled and undervalued. But the rigidity in the thinking and the behaviours again stems from anxiety around chaos and imperfection rather than from a desire to dominate. A narcissistic partner, however, will undermine the partner's self-esteem through manipulation and belittling them just so that they can feel superior. A narcissist prioritizes their own ego over everything and everyone else, even their partners. So an example could be someone is cooking a meal and someone with OCPD takes over the cooking because they believe the partner isn't doing it properly. Whereas someone with NPD could not just criticize and judge the cooking, but they will also personalize it about the type of person the partner is. And they'll also point out to others publicly what the partner does wrong whenever they're cooking, just to try to undermine them or embarrass them. So there are just 8 ways OCPD and NPD can look alike, however the motivations behind the behaviours are different. And while rare, in some cases OCPD and NPD can be comorbid, which would blend perfectionism with grandiosity and could intensify controlling and overly critical behaviours. Now, if there's anything I've missed, anything you might like to add, please feel free to use the comments section or some interesting conversation start from these videos. I'm Darren McGee, and if you find this topic to be interesting, please consider subscribing to my channel. And until next time, thanks for watching.